Now, the window of opportunity to beat climate change is rapidly closing. Extreme weather events will only get worse unless the world acts now to secure a livable future for all. The stark predictions are outlined in a UN report that's expected to shape climate policy in the years to come. Our environment editor Nick Clark explains.
In every country, on every continent, the climate emergency is taking hold. This is Malawi, hundreds dead, hundreds of thousands displaced. The cause, a record-breaking cyclone. On the other side of the world, in Argentina, endless, brutal heat, compounding a drought with farmers facing losses estimated at $14 billion. So now we have this latest call to arms from the United Nations with what should become the fundamental policy document for shaping climate action. It is the distillation of years of work by hundreds of scientists. And these are the key points. In the past decade, there have been 15 times more deaths from droughts, floods and storms in more vulnerable regions. Carbon emissions, they need to drop, and rapidly. In fact, they need to cut by almost half in just 7 years if global warming is to be limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But a rapid and far-reaching transition could pull us back from the brink. And to help do that, developed countries need to stump up hundreds of billions of dollars every year to vulnerable nations, something they've so far failed to do. Whether or not world leaders will act is another matter. It's not as if there weren't warnings long ago. And this was former NASA climate scientist James Hansen way back in 1988.
Altogether, this evidence represents a very strong case, in my opinion, that the greenhouse effect has been detected and it is changing our climate now.
Well, as we now know, the world didn't listen. 35 years on, fossil fuel emissions continue to increase along with colossal profits for the oil giants. And temperatures, yes, of course, they're going up too. And now, say the experts, once and for all, we need to act before that window of opportunity slams shut.
Well, let's now speak to Aditi Mukherji, who's one of the authors of the IPCC synthesis report. She's live from Interlaken, where the report was released earlier today. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. This is the culmination of work by hundreds of scientists and experts, including yourself, over 8 years. What makes this report, first of all, more important than any other report you've worked on?
This report is extremely policy relevant because it's providing a synthesis of all the science and the policy work that has happened in the IPCC. It's a combination of the 6 reports that happened in this cycle. And it's actually also telling us that while the reality is dire, there is reason for hope. And that's because the report also lists a whole lot of solutions that can be and should be implemented on an urgent basis for us to avoid some of the crisis that was described.
Let's talk about some of those solutions, because the report covers various aspects, of course, of the climate crisis. What is the most immediate and drastic action that countries need to make to prevent our planet from overheating to dangerous levels?
Most important is deep, rapid and sustained reductions in emissions, in greenhouse emissions. And to be on the track for 1.5 degree, we have to halve emissions by the end of this decade. Having said that, what is also equally needed is we already know that impacts are happening, and those who are facing most of the impacts are some of the most vulnerable, the ones who have not emitted. So the ones who have emitted the least are the most vulnerable. So adaptation also is extremely important for helping those vulnerable communities to adapt better to the impacts. But one of the main findings of the report is that even the way we adapt, what we are doing today will not be as effective at a higher level of global warming. So mitigation, reducing emissions is one of the most important climate solutions, followed by adaptation.
Yeah, the report calls for the reduction of fossil fuel emissions. But, as you know, the world's 2 biggest polluters, China and the US, are continuing to approve new fossil fuel projects. Just last week, the Biden administration approved an enormous oil drilling project in Alaska. There clearly seems to be a lack of political will.
The report underlines the importance of, so the report actually says that we have the solutions. What's required are political will, governance, policies, and institutions to actually implement those solutions. So it's as if we don't know what we need to do. We know we have the solutions. Now what we need is that political commitment and the will to go ahead and do what's needed to secure a livable future for us and for our children.
But what are the strategies then to reduce fossil fuel emissions? How do you convince these governments that are still doing it?
I think the job of the IPCC synthesis report, we as scientists, is to provide a whole lot of options, a menu of options of how to go ahead. Then it actually remains with the policymakers of how they want to implement. So as scientists, we have done our job in providing those evidence and to be taken up by the policymakers.
So the report is, I understand, a benchmark for governments' discussions on climate change, and it lays the groundwork for the next COP meeting in Dubai at the end of this year. Now, last year's climate talks in Sharm el-Sheikh, language calling, for example, for an end to fossil fuels was struck from the final agreement after pressure from several oil-producing countries. You wonder how valid this process, the UN climate process, is when recommendations that are made by scientists like yourself are simply ignored.
Again, as I said, as scientists, our job is to provide that evidence, and the way it is implemented leaves a lot to be desired, as you are very rightly pointing out. The other big part of the report that we talked about this time and was also talked about in the Sharm el-Sheikh is around losses and damages. So we, for the first time, have evidence saying that losses and damages is already happening. It's not as if we have to wait for the future to see those losses and damages. And we talk about the importance of finance in the context of not only overall climate finance, but also the loss and damage fund that is being set up. So there are those very important findings from the report that we as scientists hope would be taken up at rates that's needed to tackle this huge crisis.
Okay, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Aditi Mukherji joining us live on the NewsHour.